just to add to that, you were making the point about how people say like, oh, well, the Chinese Navy, they've never been in combat. I think it was actually you, Jim, that made the point on the show that the U.S. Navy also has not had a naval war really since like World War II. It's primarily the U.S. Navy has been relegated to a supplemental force helping ground forces in the Middle East. So this is if there is a naval war between the U.S. and China, that is new for both sides.
Right. I think, this is, people get really touchy inside the U.S. Navy when you talk about it because you don't want to disparage the people who are serving today. I wouldn't certainly disparage my shipmates. But the measure, at least during the Cold War, the measure of a Navy was, were you going to sea? Because, for instance, I served the first 20 years of my sea service time when I was in sea duty on carriers, aircraft carriers. And when you're in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or the South China Sea, and you're launching and recovering fighter aircraft, 40 or 25 on a cycle and a couple hundred a day, and you're doing those flight operations, you may not drop a bomb on somebody, but you're doing everything up to the point of dropping the weapon. You're in the middle of the ocean. The sea is pitching and rolling. You're doing it at night. You're doing it in bad weather. And pilots are taking off and launching. So the steam catapult, now soon to be these electromagnetic catapults, but the catapult function is being tested every time they shoot an aircraft off by the millions, when you combine all of our carriers over all these years. And then you recover them. And you have to put weapons on them. You have to refuel them. You have to spot them on the deck. You have to put some below deck. And that's dangerous. That's inherently dangerous. When I joined the U.S. Navy in 1986, the statistic was 1 in 4 pilots would probably die throughout their career. Okay. And then we improve procedures and things change and whatnot. But it's a dangerous business. So the mark of a true Navy, and that's how we used to look at the Soviet Navy, was, are they at sea? Are they going to sea? And at some points in the Cold War, the Soviet Navy spent a lot more time at anchorage than our Navy did. In the Mediterranean, for instance, they would have anchorages where their ships would come, throw the hook down, and they would sit there, and then they would go out and do something and then come back and put the hook down, where we were constantly moving, constantly going and operating. And so what we're seeing from the Chinese over the last 25 years is a predominantly coastal Navy. The PLA Navy was staying around their coast, and they didn't really go to sea for extended periods. That's the way it was in 99, 2000. And now in 2023, they're sending ships on this big adventure around the Western Pacific, or they're sending ships to the Gulf of Aden, or they're sending submarines. We don't even know where some of their ballistic missile submarines are going, but we know that they're going on patrols because we've had the Pacific Fleet commander say that they're on patrols. So we know that their ballistic missile submarines, the Jin class, are on patrol. So they're exhibiting, and there's been other reporting that's escaping my mind, but there's been other reporting that talks about the increase. I think Admiral Swift talked about it probably 5, 6, 7 years ago when he was the Pacific Fleet commander, about the increased numbers of days at sea that the PLA Navy was having. So they are exhibiting all the traits of what you would want from a wartime Navy: going to sea, being at sea, operating at sea. Now, are they as good as us? They're carriers? No. When they operated here now in the last 2 years, they've ramped up carrier operations east of the first island chain, east of Taiwan, the Shandong, the Liaoning, both have operated east of Taiwan, near Guam even. They're out there flying jets off of their aircraft carrier. Now, the Japanese observe, the Taiwans observe. We've heard reports that if they're out there for a week, they may get 200 sorties in. Well, that's not very much compared to U.S. Navy aircraft carrier. Everybody knows that. But the point is that they're rapidly making advancements in this area. And even if it's not equivalent to ours, it's another thing that we have to plan for, think about, and target.
And you mentioned the submarines. There was that time, I think it was somewhere in the early 2000s, when a Chinese submarine basically was tailing a U.S. ship, and the U.S. side didn't know it was there until it surfaced.
October 26, 2006, a Song-class diesel submarine or air-independent propulsion submarine popped up behind the USS Kitty Hawk and was within a couple of miles of the USS Kitty Hawk, east of Okinawa. So, yeah, that was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people. And told us that they had, before that, they'd had some problems with their submarine force, and the chief of the Chinese Navy, then Admiral Wo Shengli, had basically put a shutdown on the submarine force for the PLA Navy because they had like 3 major events and accidents in the space of a year, and so he put a kind of a moratorium. He kind of just shut them down and said, "You got to get your act together," and that was in the 03, 04 timeframe. And then here we were 2 years later, they're back. And that kind of opened up a new era of out of what they call out of area PLA submarine operations. But that's 17 years ago that the song popped up behind the Kitty Hawk.
That seems like a long time that the PLA has had to improve their submarines.
Right. They have. They've improved their submarines and their operations. So they're not inferior, I guess was getting back to Shelley's question, which is that people that complain and say the PLA Navy's not capable don't really know what they're talking about.
What makes a submarine undetectable? Like, why can't the U.S. detect what China's doing with its submarines?
Well, there's a lot of factors that make submarines hard to detect because, first of all, they're underwater. So you can't see them like you can see a regular ship, right? So, and then when they do stay underwater, they can do things where they can mask themselves under different layers of the ocean based upon the temperature and salinity and try to hide their acoustic signature. The Chinese submarines, there was just a report that just came out. I think you guys may have seen it from the Navy War College's China Maritime Studies Institute, their China report number 30 about Chinese next generation of Chinese nuclear submarines, both the fast attack and the nuclear submarine. And they're talking about in that book that, they use the words, the PRC Navy's on the verge of finally having world-class nuclear submarines. I kind of been critical of that today in some of my emails. I think they're not on the verge. I think they're there. I think they've developed these submarines and the technologies to improve their quieting and so we'll see about how many of these they produce and how fast they produce them. But I would guess before 2030, they're going to have a whole new stable of nuclear submarines, fast attack and ballistic missile.
And this is a problem I've had. Like, I've had some people write to me pretty angrily, and well, frankly, they tend to be boomers who are upset at me for mentioning some of these points because they're still in the mindset, America has the greatest military in the world. And by talking about, China being a threat, I'm spreading Chinese propaganda. China is no threat.
Yeah, see, well, first of all, by my age, I'm a boomer, so I apologize, even though I'm wearing a Aloha shirt. So, on the other hand, and I was also in the Navy, so I don't want to disrespect the service that I love, but you have to be honest with yourself. One of the things I learned working with all different communities, and the 3 major communities in the U.S. Navy are aviation, surface ships, and submarines, and they each have different unique qualities. But I know from the submarine community, they have this really zero defect mentality when it comes to dealing with nuclear power and nuclear issues. When you're in a tube, several hundred feet underwater, a steel tube with a nuclear reactor inside the steel tube, you don't sweep things under the rug. So there's no rug down there. And so they take seriously, every little thing that happens, and they go back, and if there's a problem, if there's a collision, if there's something that happens, they're ruthless in their examination of the problem. And there's no wokeism in that. It's pure what happened, how did it happen, what failed, and how do we improve that and make sure that never happens again. It's part of a thing they call the SubSafe program. And so they're very meticulous about documenting the problems down to, from the performance of materials to the performance of personnel and everything in between. And so if you can't do that, and they all say to themselves, we failed here. I mean, and they don't deny reality. For instance, we had the USS San Francisco hit a seamount several years ago. I forget what year now. I think it was 2009, but don't quote me. And when that happened, the U.S. Navy submarine force, Submarine Pacific, didn't say, oh, well, that didn't happen, I don't have to pay attention. They brought that submarine home, they looked at it, and they took pictures of it, and they showed it to people, and they saw that they had a problem. They hit a seamount. Why did they hit a seamount? And they went through a very detailed examination, and they didn't lie to themselves and say, well, it was the seamount's fault because the seamount did this, such and such. No, it was a failure because they didn't have that seamount located on the charts that were on board that submarine. So that was the failure. I think that was the failure, if my memory serves me. So they don't hide from it. And aviators are the same way, and most military people are like that. You can't. Your life depends upon it. So why should we, in this arena, lie to ourselves about something and feel like we're denigrating the Navy because we say the Chinese Navy is strong? That's not a comment about the U.S. Navy. It's a comment about the Chinese Navy, and we have to deal with that. And if they are strong and they have lots of platforms and they have a lot of weapon systems that we may not have or have reach as long as they have, then we have to say to ourselves, what are we doing to counter that so that we can survive a war at sea or survive any other kind of conflict in the region that would require naval support?
Yeah, I think a lot of people who make these comments are keyboard warriors, so not exactly putting their lives on the line.